All right, class. This is going to be a two-part unit two. We're going to look at two separate civilizations, the Hebrews and the Greeks. Uh, One of the unique things about these civilizations is that both of them, the Hebrews and the Greeks, relatively small groups of people with a disproportionately huge influence on our civilization to this day. So before we get into the Hebrews, and we're going to use different terms kind of interchangeably, the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews, for the purpose of this course, we can kind of lump that together. There's some distinction, but we can kind of use those words interchangeably. So before we get into ancient Israel and Judaism, I want to start with a document to kind of bridge the end of Unit 1 with the beginning of Unit 2. So Hammurabi's Code. We talked about at the end of the last unit the emergence of the first governments, the first states, and how all governments fundamentally, it's a few things they need to do right off the bat, and one of them is have laws and law enforcement. And so, what I want to start with here is some excerpts from Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code is basically the oldest surviving written code of laws that we're aware of. Right? And you can see it's from 2000 BC or BCE, a little over 4,000 years ago. And these are laws that were written by Hammurabi and were applied in mostly in the area of what is today Iraq, right? The ancient Fertile Crescent area of the Middle East. And so I just want to go through a few of these laws and have you focus in on a couple things. I mean, first of all, just being able to understand what the laws are and what they say, um, and kind of be able to compare and contrast them to our current modern list of laws. It's going to be a lot of differences, of course, um, but there's going to be some similarities that I think you might find interesting. A lot of the laws, the first couple here, have to do with making false accusations. Um, in our current American context, if it were a crime to lie about someone, our prisons would be even more full than they already are, specifically with journalists. Anyway, that's less relevant to our current law code. Um, they had fugitive slave laws as a reminder that all of these cultures that we're going to cover in this course had slavery, and therefore they had laws on how to deal with slavery, right? There's fugitive slave laws. Um, this is one that I think is quite relevant that we'll spend a decent amount of time on in this video. If a builder builds a house for someone, doesn't construct it properly, and the house collapses and kills the person, the builder shall be put to death. Now, we still have laws in our modern legal system in the West, in the United States to this day, with the exact same premise behind them. Now, maybe the penalty isn't the death penalty, but the premise should be kind of familiar to you. This is what's called, there's different terms for it. The term you may have heard is a liability law or a malpractice or negligence kind of idea. A liability law says that if someone is providing a good or a service and they are negligent, they are reckless, they are careless, and someone gets hurt or killed, then the person providing the good or the service that was reckless, negligent, or careless, they are legally responsible. Now, again, they're probably not going to be put to death, but they could be fined a huge sum of money. They could do prison time. And so we'll go over some examples of that in a few minutes, but that is an example of how Hammurabi's code from 4,000 years ago, you can start to see the beginnings of legal ideas that are still very much a part of our legal system, right? Liability laws, for example. If a son strikes his father, his hand shall be hewn off. Wow. That's about hierarchy. I want to stipulate something here that one of the ideals that we talked about that Western civilization is supposed to be based on is the rule of law, and the ideal that everyone's supposed to be equal under the law, and the law is supposed to, justice is blind, right? The law is supposed to apply the same to everybody, regardless of who you are. Now, we can debate all day how effective we are at living up to that ideal. The point I want to make here is that all throughout Hammurabi's code, you will see that they're not even pretending that there's equality under the law. They have slavery. That, by definition, violates equality under the law. This law here, if a son strikes his father, the kid's hand gets cut off. Now ask yourself, what happens in this system if the father strikes the son? Nothing. So there's no equality under the law. It depends on who you are. Here's another example. If a man strikes a freeborn woman, since they have slavery, they need to stipulate freeborn so that she loses her unborn child. I mean, strike is maybe not strong enough of a word for the kind of physical assault that would lead a woman to have a miscarriage. He shall pay restitution, reparations, has to pay her for her loss. Now, again, they're stipulating freeborn child, or freeborn woman, rather. We can therefore presume that if a man does this same thing to a slave woman, there would be lesser penalty or no penalty at all. If a man knocks the teeth out of another man, his own teeth will be knocked out. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If anyone strikes a man higher in rank, he'll be whipped. Again, hierarchy. If you can strike someone lower on the hierarchy, no problem. But if you violate the hierarchy, which by definition means not equality under the law, then you'll be punished. If a slave strikes a free person, again, hierarchy, no equality under the law, his ears shall be cut off. Now, why wouldn't they cut the slave's hand off? Because then the slave can't work. If anyone commits a robbery and is caught, he shall be put to death. Robbery is still illegal in our culture, doesn't carry the death penalty, but so here's what we can summarize. A couple big ideas from Hammurabi's code. The punishments may seem severe and brutal. Fine. And some of the laws may not seem super relevant anymore. A couple of big picture things I want you to take from this. Number one, there is no equality under the law in this system. A lot of the crimes aren't crimes if one person does it, but it is a crime if another person does it, and or it depends on who you do it to, right? You can't strike someone higher in rank, but you can strike someone lower in rank. You can't attack a freeborn woman, but you can attack a slave woman. You can't strike your father, but you can strike your son. Right? So there's built-in lack of equality under the law. However, we do see some similarities, specifically liability law. Talk more about that in a minute. And don't commit robbery. So kind of, compare and contrast. On the one hand, it's this weird, ancient, brutal thing. On the other hand, parts of it are things that we can totally recognize and relate with. Now, segueing into Judaism and ancient Israel. Judaism as a religion contributed a lot of ideas, both religious and more just straight philosophical, that are very impactful to this day in our culture. Now, one of the first main ideas that Judaism introduced, and at the beginning here, I want to stipulate something. When I say that the Jews were the first to do this and the first to do that and the first to do this, what I am saying is, as far as we know, based on the evidence that we have, the Jews were the first to do X, Y, and Z. Do I know for a moral certainty that the Jews were actually the very first group on the planet to do these things that we're about to talk about? No, I don't, and nobody does. We can only go off what we know, right? So in terms of the written record that survives, in terms of what we know, the first time certain things pop up in the historical record, it's very often the Jews that are doing it, right? That's kind of the context of when I say they introduced this, they were the first to do that. Take it with that caveat, okay? So as far as we know, they introduced the idea of monotheism. All religions that we're aware of previous to this were polytheistic, meaning worshiping many gods. And the Jews introduced the idea there's not 50 gods, there's not 12 gods, there's not zero gods, there's one God, monotheism. Now, that one idea has grown to dominate the world. So, in the world map here, you can see in purple, those are the areas where, the darker the purple, the higher percentage of people. It's measuring what percentage of people in those areas identify as monotheistic, as believing in one God. Now, I want to make something super clear. Almost none of those people are Jewish. We'll talk about this in a minute. The Jews are an incredibly small group of people. The overwhelming majority of the people portrayed on this map in the purple areas, the overwhelming majority, 99% of them, are not Jews. They're Christians or Muslims. But the point is, the Jews introduced this idea of monotheism, and then that idea is accepted and adopted by Christianity and Islam, which grow to be exponentially larger than Judaism in terms of numbers. Okay. The exception to majority monotheistic populations, as you can see on the map, is in East Asia and South Asia, specifically India, China, and Southeast Asia. And but still, in terms of religious worldview, the dominant view to this day is some sort of monotheism. And we can trace that back to the Jews. Now, we just talked about liability law in Hammurabi's Code. In the Old Testament of the Bible, which, this isn't theology class, but just to lay out a couple things that I want to make sure you understand. Um, the Bible has two parts, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament came first, obviously. It is much, much, much longer than the New Testament. And there's a lot in it. And the Old Testament was written by this culture, by the Jews. And there's a lot in it. Obviously, there's theology. We'll go over a little bit of that. There's a lot of history in it. We'll go over a little bit of that. There's a lot of philosophy and legal theory. And we're going to go over that right now, actually. In the book of Exodus, second book of the Bible, among other things, there's the story of Moses and leading the Jews out of Egypt and a lot of stories that you may be familiar with. There's also a bunch of legal ideas. And here's one. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner. Now, is this relevant to you in the sense that you're walking around the United States in the 21st century and someone falls into a pit or a donkey falls into a pit or something? Not really. That's not the point. The point is, just like in Hammurabi's Code, this is from thousands of years ago, a liability law. If you are reckless, negligent, careless, and someone or something gets hurt, that's on you. You're legally responsible. Let's flash forward. You will see this idea everywhere throughout our society. Once you know how to spot it, you'll realize it's all over the place. Couple examples, the coffee cup pictured here. There was an infamous liability case back in the day, but probably, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago now. Um, the McDonald's coffee cup case. And what happened in this case is a woman went through the drive-through at McDonald's, ordered her coffee, and it was first of all, coffee is hot, obviously, but this coffee was way too hot. And so, I mean, it was scalding. And the woman spilled the coffee into her. She's sitting in her car and she spills it all into her lap and upper thighs and that region. I don't want to get too specific, but you know what I'm talking about. Very uncomfortable place to get burned, to say the least. And got really, really bad burns. And she sued McDonald's under this principle of liability. They were reckless, negligent, careless. The coffee was way too hot, way too hot. And that's on them. They have a responsibility to make sure their customers are safe. And look, people have accidents all the time, but th this was more than an accident. This was, she didn't sue because she accidentally spilled. She sued because the thing that she accidentally spilled was not safe. It was scalding hot rather than normal coffee temperature hot. And that's a case that a lot of people may have heard of. You will see this everywhere. If you ever wonder, like, why, when you go get a coffee, does the business that you're getting it from, why do they take the time and the money and the resources to print obvious warnings on all kinds of packaging? Why do they do that? Whenever you order like an article of clothing or a pair of shoes or something, and let's say Amazon drops it off your house and you open up the box, there's those little silica packets in there, right? To kind of keep out humidity or whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about? And what does it say on the outside of the package of silica? Do not eat. Again, that costs time and money to print obvious warnings. Do not eat the silica. Like, duh, were you actually going to eat it unless you saw that warning? Well, someone would have, and then they would have sued. And so part of our system of liability law is that companies realize because of liability laws, they need to put warnings on everything, even if they seem ridiculously obvious, right? I have young kids, and when you have kids, you'll see this. Whenever you buy a toy for a kid, there's warnings all over it. Whenever I buy Legos for my 8-year-olds, why does it say, 6 and over? Because 2-year-olds put stuff in their mouth. And Lego knows that, so they need to preempt a lawsuit if, God forbid, someone buys Legos for their 2-year-old and the 2-year-old chokes on a Lego, right? So you'll see this idea of people suing for recklessness, negligence, whatever it might be, malpractice. Doctors get sued all the time, um, sometimes justly, sometimes just because people are angry. It's all throughout our society. There's warnings everywhere, there's lawsuits everywhere. Now, do some people abuse these laws? Yes. Do some people go into Walmart and pretend to fall down and hurt their neck and sue for $5 million? Yes. But the principle behind this is really important. We need to let businesses in general, people who provide goods and services, we need to let them know that if they are careless, reckless, negligent, if they cut corners and a customer gets hurt or, God forbid, killed, that business will pay. They need to know that. And in theory, that keeps us all safe. All right. So it's an ancient idea from Hammurabi's Code and from the Old Testament of the Bible that we still see throughout our system. Another very relevant legal debate that the Jews were having thousands of years ago. What do they say in the book of Exodus? Again, this is ancient. The book of Exodus is right after the book of Genesis, right? It's about as old as it gets in terms of religious and legal thought. If a thief is found breaking in and is beaten to death, no blood guilt is incurred. Beaten to death sounds kind of extreme. There were no firearms back then. So basically, let me paraphrase this for modern and put it in modern language. If someone breaks into your house and you kill them, that's not murder. That is a lawful, right? Murder is an unlawful killing. It is lawful, according to the book of Exodus, to kill someone if they break into your house. Now, The big picture debate here continues today in our legal system. What's the debate? The debate is, when is it lawful, aka not murder, to kill someone? That's a very contentious debate that people have been having for thousands of years, including in ancient Israel. In our modern context, there's a couple terms that I want you to be familiar with. Castle doctrine. That's not a modern term, but it's still part of our system. Castle doctrine, if you've ever heard the phrase, a man's home is his castle, castle doctrine says if someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night, basically, and you shoot them, that's not murder. Now, there are many, many exceptions to this. It depends on what state you live in. It depends on a lot of different variables, but generally speaking, you have more protection from being charged with murder if the context of the killing is someone who wasn't supposed to be in my house came in my house and I felt threatened. Usually, our legal system will be much more forgiving to you in a scenario like that. Usually, not always, depends on what state you live in. If you want to look into this for a current event, duty to retreat. See in the bottom of that placard, it says no duty to retreat. Think about this for yourself as a practical matter. Think about your house, wherever you lay your head down at night. Think about physically how it's laid out. Think about who else is there. Do you live by yourself? Do you have kids? Does grandma stay with you? Right? Think about all those variables and think about it's 3 in the morning and you wake up because someone has broken into your house. What do? You call the cops, sure, but the cops might take 15 minutes to get there. What do you do for that 15 minutes? Do you retreat? Is that practical for you? Can you jump out a window? Can you run out your front door? Does it depend on where the intruder is? Are there other people in your house? Is it realistic that you would be able to get everybody out of the house and not come in contact with the intruder and not put anyone in danger and just quickly, efficiently, everyone escapes? And if so, that's great. But even if that's the case, is it your duty to retreat from your own house because some criminal broke in? Or do you have the right to stand your grounds and, if necessary, use deadly force if you feel threatened? It's a really contentious debate. Now, stand your grounds is an expansion of this idea. Stand your ground says you can use deadly force if you feel threatened, even if you're not in your house. You can just be out in public and something happens and you feel threatened. You don't need to run. You don't need to retreat. You can stand your grounds and use deadly force. Now, geez, over 10 years ago now, that one of the most infamous cases of stand your ground that you may have heard of was in Florida. Florida was one of the first states to pass stand your ground laws. And again, it takes this ancient idea of castle doctrine. If you break into my house in the middle of the night, no offense, I'm going to shoot you and I'm not being charged with murder. Takes that idea and says you can act, you can apply that logic even if you're not in your house, even if you're walking down the street. So, young man pictured on the right is called Trayvon Martin. You may have heard that name. Really infamous case from probably 12, 13 years ago now. And basically, he's walking through the street in the neighborhood where he lives. Someone, not a police officer, just a civilian, sees him, thinks he looks suspicious for whatever reason, um, starts following him. Not a police officer, just starts following this kid. He calls the police. He's on the phone with the police. And at some point, this young man turns around and confronts this guy, like, who are you? Why are you following me? And a physical altercation ensues. And the person who started following this young man starts losing this fight. He's on the ground getting punched in the face, and he is now afraid for his safety and or his life, and he pulls out a concealed firearm and kills this young man. He's charged with murder. And in a very infamous, controversial, contentious case, he was acquitted, found not guilty of murder because he successfully argued, hey, you know, I was in fear for my life. I was on my back on the concrete getting punched in the face. I was fearful that I was going to pass out or that this young man was going to find my gun and shoot me with my own gun. I had to act in self-defense. The jury agreed with his argument and he was found not guilty. Really divisive, contentious, controversial case. If you want to look into this, there are stand your ground cases on a regular basis all over this country. But the big picture legal concepts that you should think about, that people have been thinking about for thousands of years, and the Jews were thinking about it in the Old Testament. When is it legal to kill someone? When is it not murder? When is it a justifiable killing? And the principle is when someone is committing a crime against you, you have a lot more forgiveness if you use lethal force against them. All right. And of course, every situation is different and there's always tons of variables. But it's something that people have been wrestling with for a very long time. Another major contribution from this culture, the Jewish culture in ancient Israel, is the Bible. I mean, even if you've never read a word of the Bible, is there any human who's like, what's the Bible? That's not a thing. The Bible is the most universally uh, shared, not necessarily believed in by everybody, of course, but it is the most universally shared in terms of we're all familiar with what it is, at least. It is the most universal thing in human history. There's no other thing. There's no other book, painting, idea, food. There's nothing that is more universally shared than the Bible. The word Bible is a Greek word. We'll get to the Greeks next. And it means the book. Now, if a book is so influential that it's just referred to as the book, that's kind of a big deal. Um, Now, what's in it? There's theology, there's moral ideas, there's legal ideas we just talked about, there's history. And when we are just in life, when we're trying to determine whether we believe something, is something credible? How do we know? How do we measure? How do we determine whether we should believe what we're being told, whether it's from a book, whether it's from a friend gossiping about something, whether it's from a teacher that's telling you something, whether it's from the news media? Well, pro tip, never believe the news media. But just in general, how do we know what's true? It's a really important skill for you to think about and develop. And some questions we can ask ourselves is, what bias did the author have? Everyone has a bias. That word a lot of times has a negative connotation. Some biases are negative. Some biases are bad, right? Um, but not necessarily. A bias is just a point of view, a perspective. We all have different opinions on things. We all have different um, views on the world. We all have different assessments of what is good, true, and beautiful, right? That's fine, right? Some people like Star Wars, some people like Star Trek, right? You have a bias towards one or the other. That's not a bad thing. It's just people are different, okay? But we need to understand that people who are relaying information to us Me, you, everybody. We all have points of view. We all have biases. That's not bad necessarily. It's just something that you need to be aware of. And so when someone's trying to convince you of something, you should ask yourself, right, where's this person coming from? What's their perspective? What's their point of view? And is there any corroborating evidence? Now, in court, this is very important. Corroborating evidence, again, if someone's trying to convince you of something, ideally, sometimes it's not possible, but if it is, you want to find corroborating evidence. Corroborating evidence is multiple different pieces of evidence that kind of point in the same direction. And the more corroborating evidence there is, the more you can be pretty confident that the thing is true. Okay. This is why in our legal system, we need to prove someone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. We can't convict people on one piece of evidence, right? We need corroborating evidence. We need, cell phone records and DNA and an eyewitness, right? We need multiple corroboration before we're comfortable concluding something in theory. Now, we'll get to the rise of Christianity a little bit later in the course, but here's an example from the Bible where we can kind of go through this process. What bias is there? Is there any corroborating evidence? How do we know, jumping ahead in the timeline a little bit, how do we know that Jesus existed? Well, mostly because of the New Testament of the Bible, right? But we have to then think, okay, well, what bias did the author of the New Testament authors, there were multiple authors, what was the bias of the people that wrote the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the accounts of Jesus. What was their bias? Well, the bias was quite obvious, right? They were pro Jesus, obviously. So they have a bias. They have a point of view. They're not neutral. And so you need to understand their point of view. Now, if someone is, in this case, pro Jesus in this example, well, that means they might have a motive for just making the story up because they want you to believe all these things about this guy, but they all have the same opinion. They all have the same bias. So they could just be making it up. So then we ask, but is there corroborating evidence? And in the case of Jesus, yes, there is. It's not just his followers that wrote about him in the New Testament. There were other groups of people that wrote about him. The Jews who didn't believe in him also wrote about him. People that weren't his followers, that weren't his supporters. And the Romans wrote about him. And those are the people that killed him. So there is corroborating evidence from multiple different groups of people writing about the same person. That's right. That's really, now we know, all right, this is legit because there's very different sources of evidence that say the same thing. Yes, this guy lived. Yes, he was crucified. And the multiple different pieces of evidence, the Christians are saying it, the Jews are saying it, the Romans are saying it, they all have very different biases. People that love this man, people that hated this man, people that didn't really care either way about this man, the people that killed this man, they didn't agree on anything, but they all wrote a very similar account. And so when you have people that have very different points of view telling you basically the same thing, that's about as good as it gets, right? In terms of, should I believe this? Yes. Yes. Right. So in life, whenever someone's trying to convince you of something, an important skill, right? Where are they coming from? What's their point of view? Are they pushing an opinion on me, trying to take it as a fact? What's their bias? And are there any other sources of information out there that say kind of the same thing? And the more sources there are, the more sure you can be that it's true. Here's another example of something being kind of verified, corroborated um, from an Old Testament source. The textbook for this course says the Bible, like all ancient documents, must be used with care. Well, yeah, not just ancient documents, all sources of information. Be careful. Don't just believe something because someone says it. We always have to be careful. One way that we can corroborate things that are written in the Bible. So if something's written down in the Bible, all right, that's only one source, and the author had a bias. They want us to believe it. That's not great evidence. How do we corroborate? Archaeology can corroborate things. Here's an example. In the Old Testament, there's an account about Joshua building an altar on Mount Ebal in 1400 BC, and they give the dimensions of the altar. So they give you a who, they give you a what, they give you a when, they give you a where, they give you a how big. All of those accounts are in the Old Testament story. Thousands of years later, archaeologists in Israel, they're on Mount Ebal. They're doing some excavation. What do they find? They find an altar. In that place. So they find that thing, an altar, in that place. They carbon date it to that date. So we have the what, we have the where, we have the when. They measure it. The dimensions line up. Now we don't have the who. It doesn't, Joshua's name isn't written on the side of it, but unless it's coincidentally someone else built an altar at that exact place, time, size, no, that's Joshua's altar, right? We can be pretty sure of that. That's a lot of corroborating evidence. So at least that account from the Old Testament, we can be pretty sure is historically accurate. Now, other things, of course, we have no idea. Some things you need to take on faith, but there are certain things in the Old Testament, as old as it is, thousands of years old, that we can be pretty sure, religion aside, are historically accurate. Another major influence on Jewish culture that we see all throughout our society today, talked about laws, stories, stories from the Old Testament. Again, if you are religious, not religious, none of my business, never read the Bible, read it cover to cover, either way, I am very confident that you are familiar with Jewish stories just because of how universal they are. Even though the huge majority of people aren't Jewish, the huge majority of people do know Jewish stories from the Old Testament. Some examples that you're probably familiar with. Adam and Eve. Everyone's heard of Adam and Eve. You know what it's shorthand for, right? Book of Genesis, creation story. It's shorthand for the first two humans, the beginning of humanity. Even if you don't believe it, even if you've never read the actual version in the book of Genesis, when I say Adam and Eve, something clicks. You're like, yeah, I know what you're referring to. Now, the story of Adam and Eve goes beyond religion. It can be seen as kind of a philosophical story, um, and a very metaphorical story about how we look at certain big picture ideas that are beyond religion. Free will versus obedience. We've talked earlier about liberty and security. This is just a human story. In the story of Adam and Eve, the authority figure, God, has a rule. And the rule is do not eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't do it. That's the rule. What do Adam and Eve do? they break the rule. Okay, what's the point of the story from a certain point of view? This is a story about free will versus obedience. Authority wants obedience. Our government wants obedience. Our parents want obedience when we're little kids. But we want free will. We don't want to be told what to do. We don't want to be bossed around. We want to be able to make our own decisions, right? And these two things are in tension. The point of the story of Adam and Eve, from a certain point of view, is that the authority figure, God, wants obedience. He wants the rule to be followed. But this is the catch. He gives the people in the story free will. This is very important. He gives them free will. If he wanted to guarantee obedience, don't eat the fruit from the knowledge or from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he could have put that tree somewhere where they couldn't get it. He could have put it on the moon, could have put it on the bottom of the ocean, could have put, right, he could have put it somewhere where it would have been impossible for the rule to be broken, but he put it right in front of them and gave them free will to decide whether to be obedient or not. And they exercise their free will. And what happens in life sometimes when we break the rules and exercise our own free will? Sometimes it goes really bad and we need to suffer the consequences. So the Adam and Eve story is an allegory for a lot more than it might look like on paper. There's a lot there, right? In our own lives, we have this constant struggle between we know what we're supposed to do and we know what we want to do, right? That's a timeless human story. Cain and Abel, right? The first murder story. Story of Moses, you've heard that story in some variation at some point, whether you read the Bible, whether you watched it on, a Disney version of it, whatever it is. Martin Luther King used the story of Moses repeatedly and to great effect, specifically the part of the story of Moses wherein Moses leads his people, the Jewish people, out of slavery in Egypt to the promised land, to Israel. Martin Luther King repeatedly, including in the last speech he gave the night before he was assassinated, would retell that story, plugging himself into it, painting this parallel of he, Martin Luther King, is Moses leading his people, African Americans instead of Jews, right, out of slavery into the promised lands, using all the same imagery. And the reason he used that story so often was in the original story of Moses in the book of Exodus and Leviticus in the Old Testament. Moses dies before the mission is accomplished. And what Martin Luther King would often say is, I might die before our movement is accomplished, but you need to go on without me and finish the job. And as you probably know, he was assassinated less than 24 hours after giving that speech, actually. So that story, right, thousands of years later, that story of Moses is just compelling. There's something about these stories that are just universally compelling, whether you're religious or not. Noah's Ark, everyone is familiar with that story. David and Goliath, right? That is used to this day as kind of like you hear it sometimes in sports. You hear it when there's some kind of competition going on where one party of the competition seems invincible and the other one's the underdog, and sometimes the underdog wins, and that's often described as a David and Goliath story. So these stories, again, beyond the religious significance, the cultural impact of Jewish stories, and there are many, many others, they are almost universally known. All right. Just something about them. Similar, when we get to ancient Greece in the next unit, you'll see a similarity with ancient Greek stories. They're very, very still very much part of our culture. The Ten Commandments. Everyone's heard of the Ten Commandments. Uh, a lot of people, historians, argue that they were influenced by Hammurabi's Code. Now, let me just give you a brief aside. Okay. I don't want to interject my own personal opinion. That shouldn't matter to you, but I need to make sure you understand something. As a religious person, the idea that the revealed law from God, the creator of the universe, was influenced by some dude named Hammurabi, no. But that aside, uh, these two cultures did coexist in a similar part of the world at a similar time. So a lot of um, historians do make this argument that the Ten Commandments were influenced by Hammurabi's Code. That's a take. Uh, there's some differences, though. They put more emphasis on righteousness than retribution. When we looked at Hammurabi's Code, if you go back and look at it, the format is if you do this, we'll do this, right? If you do this, we'll cut your hand off. If you do this, we'll whip you. If you do this, we'll kill you. If you do this, we'll knock your teeth out. That's about retribution. That's about a threat. The Ten Commandments is generally worded more as here's how to be a good person. Do this, do this, do this, right? Honor your father and your mother. And there was also, of course, some don't do this, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not bear false witness, but it doesn't say thou shalt not bear false witness, and if you do, we'll cut your hand off. It doesn't say that, right? So it's much more about positive reinforcement. There's also this idea, which was, pretty unique at the time, as far as we know, that the point of religion and the obligation of religious people was not just this vertical relationship where the worshiper, the religious person worships the god, the gods, whatever it is that they believe in vertically, right? Like I'm down here and I'm worshiping and I need to do my sacrifices and follow certain rules and, observe certain holidays, etc. I need to show loyalty to whatever it is that I worship. All religion has that, of course, and so does Judaism. But Judaism stresses, in addition to that, a horizontal relationship, not just between you and God vertically, but between you and other people. And that what what God wants is not just for people to fear and respect God, but also to be good to each other. And that was kind of a radical idea. And that, again, religion aside, that's a pretty fundamentally important idea. That if we don't love each other, that might sound naive and melodramatic. Use another word. If we don't respect each other, if we don't tolerate each other, we can't have a society, right? It's pretty basic. So it's not just a you know, top down vertical relationship between the religious person and what it is they're worshiping. It's a horizontal relationship. And ultimately, the emergence of Christianity kind of codifies this later. And it grew out of Judaism. We'll cover that in a couple of units. So the vertical up and down relationship between the religious person and God, right? You have certain obligations that you're responsible for. But there's also a horizontal relationship where the authority, God, wants us not just to worship him and follow his rules, but also to love each other, to be good to each other. Even if we even strangers, right? And the Jews were big on this. that we have a moral code to follow, and that is our responsibility, even to outsiders, even to slaves, even to immigrants, even to people who aren't Jewish, even to people who don't look anything like us, total strangers. We still have obligations to be respectful to them. And so when Christianity comes along, again, what they add is this idea that, all right, we have this vertical relationship, obligation to God, horizontal relationship, obligation to each other. And then fundamentally, when Christianity emerges, if you're familiar with Christian iconography, with the crucifix specifically, what or who is at the center, at the intersection of these two relationships? Right. And if you are familiar with the crucifix, you know what or who is at the intersection of these two lines, right? Um, Back to the more historical stuff. So we talked about legal ideas, religious ideas, stories, philosophical ideas that are, again, very widespread throughout our society. Even if you are not remotely religious, they impact your life in secular ways. We'll get to the Roman Empire a little later, but to preview something, the Romans conquered Israel at a certain point. Everybody's conquered Israel at a certain point. And this is from, so when I was in Israel, so this is me, I'm up on a mountain looking down into the valley below, and you can see the obvious outline of an old Roman camp, right? So what had happened here in this case was a few thousand years ago, the Romans conquer Israel. There are certain numbers of Jews who refuse to live under Roman rule, so they flee out into the desert and they build a community on top of this mountain. And they're up there for a few years. And the Romans want to force them down, so they build this camp, and eventually the Romans that were living in that camp built a ramp all the way up the side of this mountain at Masada to force the Jews back down to live under Roman control. And the Jews, as the Romans are about to get to the top of the mountain to force them down, they commit mass suicide. All right. And they leave a couple people alive to explain to the Romans why they did what they did. And the reason I'm raising that story is that I want to make sure that you understand something that's lost on a lot of people. When people think about anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, people, trying to kill the Jews, in our culture, the first person that we associate with that behavior is Hitler. And he is the most infamous example of that, to be sure. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism. He did not invent Jew hatred. Jew hatred and anti-Semitism are as old as Western civilization. People have always been trying to persecute and or kill the Jews forever. All right, didn't start with Hitler, didn't end with Hitler. It's important you understand that. So that raises the question, if they've been persecuted for thousands of years, which they have been, how are they still around? And one theory is the way that Judaism is organized. The textbook points out kings or other political leaders are not essential. Now they have, in history, kings and political leaders, but they don't have a really strict hierarchy. They have a more kind of egalitarian model where there's no one single person or small group of people that are necessary for the group to survive. They don't have this strict hierarchy. So, the power and the knowledge and the culture and whatever it is that makes a group is spread out in a way that in other groups it's not. And so, there's no one indispensable person in Judaism. And that allows something, like the Holocaust, which kills a third of the group, but the group survives because the ideas that they have, the culture, the thing that makes them Jewish is not entrusted to any one person. All right. So if you want any group, an organization, a business, a sports team, whatever it is, to survive a long time, you don't want to put all of the power or authority or whatever else into one person because people come and go, people die. And so Judaism has been incredibly effective at that, right? Sharing the culture broadly so that even when catastrophe happens, there are people that are going to be able to carry on the culture for thousands of years. I'm showing you this chart for two reasons. One, jumping way ahead in the timeline from ancient Israel to more modern, the Holocaust, you can see here, right, that huge drop in population, right? That's the Holocaust. That shouldn't surprise you. The reason, though, I think the more important thing I want you to notice is throughout all of the history of Judaism, going back thousands of years, the peak number of Jews that have ever been alive on the planet at one time was 1939, and it was 17 million. That's not a lot of people. 17 million people. That's it. Now, talked about anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. It's as old as Judaism. Why do certain people have such hostility towards the Jews? There are many different variations of it, but one that I want you to think about because it ties to something we talked about earlier is unequal outcome. I just showed you the data. This is a very small group of people, 17 million at its peak. But as I've tried to give you examples of, this very, very tiny group of people has an enormously outsized influence on our society. There's no denying that. There are certain um, stereotypes and cliches, many of them negative, about Jews. And but there's one measurable reality that I want you to understand that sometimes people say is like a negative stereotype. It's not. Okay. Here's a measurable reality about Jews. Based on how few of them they are unbelievably successful and influential. They are, statistically, in you name it, in culture, in media, in business, in finance, in the medical fields, in the social sciences. That's not a negative stereotype. That's an objective observation of a measurable reality. Here's this statistic. Jews account for 0.2% of the global population. 0.2%. So that's one out of every about 500 people. 0.2%. Um, that 0.2% of humans accounts for over 20% of Nobel Prize winners in all fields. Economics, peace, chemistry, you name it. Whatever Nobel Prizes are given for, Jews have won more than 1 in 5 of them, even though Jews only account for roughly one out of every 500 people. Therefore, Jews have won 100 times as many Nobel Prizes as you would predict them to have won based on how few of them there are. Now, when you see disproportionate success like that, there are two general reactions that people will have. Reaction number one, that is unbelievably inspiring. That's incredible that this tiny group of people who other people have been trying to murder for thousands of years, who have been repeatedly persecuted, driven from their country, enslaved, subjected to genocide, you name it, that group of people, that tiny group of people, despite all of that persecution, is still that successful. That is an incredibly inspiring story. I have a ton of respect for anyone who can do that. That's one reaction. The other reaction is, um, these people are too successful, they're too influential, it's not fair. We should probably kill all of them. So hopefully you can see how it's a pretty distinct fork in the road, right? A lot of anti-Semitism is predicated on straight up envy, just jealousy, just straight up old-fashioned envy. These people are successful, let's tear them down. Some examples, a couple random, more modern examples of small, small group of people, outsized influence. Freud, if you've heard of any student of the mind, if you had to name one person who's famous for thinking about how our brains work, it's Freud. If you had to think of one person who's known for thinking about how the physical universe works, it's probably Einstein. If you had to think of one person who's had the most influence on certain economic thought, it's Karl Marx. These three men, just random examples, have had outsized influence on human history in all different walks of life. Whether the influences were good or bad is a whole nother discussion, but the influence is there. And they all just so happen to have been members of this teeny, teeny, tiny group with this outsized influence on civilization. Right? It's a remarkable thing. Um, now, a lot of I want to be careful to not conflate two things that are often, it's a very contentious issue. How do these two things connect? I just try to give you a brief synopsis of the history of Jew hatred. A lot of where that issue comes up today is issues swirling around the modern state of Israel. And I want to make something clear. Criticizing the modern government of the state of Israel is not equivalent to pathological Jew hatred. Now, sometimes there's a lot of overlap, okay? Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of overlap. Obviously, people who just hate Jews blindly also hate the government of the state of Israel, obviously. But what I'm saying is, I know a lot of really good, well-intentioned people who are not anti-Semitic, but who also have serious criticisms of the Israeli government. So I'm not trying to conflate those things. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same thing. Okay. But in the modern context of the state of Israel, it existed thousands of years ago, as we talked about, and the Jews were repeatedly exiled, slavery in Egypt, then they come back, then the Babylonians come in, then they're exiled to Persia, then they come back, and blah, 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 blah. The most recent iteration of this is the formation of the modern state of Israel after the Holocaust, the reformation of the state of Israel. And over time, over the last 80 years, the Israeli state has displaced Arab Muslims, referred to as Palestinians, who lived in that area alongside the Jews for many, many centuries. That's a reality. There's no denying that. Significant numbers of Palestinian people have been displaced by virtue of Israel existing. That's true. This map is a little misleading for reasons we don't need to really get into for the purposes of this course, but what I want you to understand is if you're interested in the modern conflict, I mean, I don't know if modern's the right word. It's been going on for thousands of years, but the modern version of it is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You should, try to empathize with both sides, understand where people are coming from. Have huge numbers of Palestinians been displaced? Yes. You know who else was displaced? Every Jew who lived in every other country in the Middle East. When the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948, all of the nations in the neighborhood, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Syria, etc., they expelled every single Jew living in all of those countries. So no one has a monopoly on being good guys or bad guys here. People on all sides have been displaced and have suffered horrendously. The path going forward, that's up for you to assess. But the story of the modern state of Israel is a classic example of a story in which whoever's telling you the story will very often leave out details to try to direct you towards a certain conclusion. And that's just something you should be aware of in any conflict like this, right? Especially one as emotional as this is for a lot of people, for very good reason, right? It's a tragedy, the entire thing. Um, in the modern state of Israel, much like their ancestors, are whatever you think about their virtues or their vices or good guys, bad guys, whatever it is you think about the modern state of Israel in terms of the Palestinian conflict, in terms of anything else, that society is under constant threat. Every single, there are a few exceptions, but almost every single Israeli, regardless of gender, men and women, when they graduate high school, have to serve in the military. In any public place you go in Israel, you're going to see 18, 19, 20-year-olds in uniform, heavily armed, in their way, from their perspective, protecting their country, being prepared to die to protect their families before they can start their adult life. Right? And people on all sides of this conflict, to some degree, have this same sense of being constantly under siege. And since the Jewish people have been dealing with this in one way or the other for a few thousand years, I wouldn't hold my breath on it ending anytime soon. All right, so that's it for this half of this unit. Unit 2 will continue next, where we'll segue into the ancient Greeks, and I will see you then.